I just want to start by welcoming everybody today to the fifth in our series of webinars. And I think that I can speak for everybody when I say that we're very thankful to have had this opportunity to connect with one another regularly and to learn from such a fantastic range of expertise. So I want to just begin by thanking all the organisers, and particularly Anna Fuchs and Valerie Norton, for bringing us together in such a thoughtful way, and in a way that's transformed the physical meetings that we should have been having into such efficient and fruitful and very nourishing sessions. So thanks very much from the get-go. So the fifth of our sessions, is the second in the series of webinars that with an explicit focus on the practice of working with ageing across the boundaries of clinical, cultural and social practice. And we'll have 3 papers today. We'll have 2 papers, then a little comfort break and a final paper. Each paper will be 15 minutes with 5 minutes response. And we'll take some questions after the first 2 papers, if that's okay, before the comfort break, and then we'll come back and have our final paper. So I just want to, without further ado, welcome the first of our speakers, Dana Walrath. And I think Dana kind of needs no introduction really to this group, but she's Atlantic Fellow for Equity in Brain Health, which is a collaboration between TCD and the University of California at San Francisco. She's a writer, she's a visual artist, and she's an anthropologist. And today's paper is entitled Between Alice and the Eagle, Dementia Journeys and the Final Breath. So I'll hand the floor to you now. Thank you, Dana.
So please join me by starting with a deep breath in and a deep breath out to remember all those who are sick or have died before their time, either from COVID-19 or from deeply embedded systemic injustice. Thank you. So I'm zooming in from unceded Abenaki land, now the state of Vermont in the northeastern United States. When the Canadian border opens someday, Montreal is only a 90-minute drive away. Now, throughout this past year, the hope that the pandemic would lead us to rethinking all our global practices and systems has kept me going. Personally, I've had it really easy during the pandemic. I live steps away from Lake Champlain and a couple of 100 acres of gorgeous forests along its shores. The Abenaki tell us that their transformer creator, Ojihozo, placed himself within a stone that rises up out of the lake so that he could always be here with this beauty. I'm a 10-minute bike ride from downtown and a 10-minute drive to the airport. And I'm listing all of this not to make you jealous, but to talk about this because change demands that we engage with our privilege. Now, this time last year, the lockdown silenced the truck and the airplane traffic that now penetrates the forest. And since that silence, a handful of billionaires used the pandemic to amass even more wealth. The global vaccine sits in 10 wealthy countries, mine the worst among them, while the pandemic devastates India. So today, as my title promises, I'll focus on death and dementia journeys across the globe within a framework that looks at growing older as a basic human right and at our responsibility to make aging more equitable. This requires seeing long life and the expensive medical privileges, interventions upon which it depends as a privilege. It requires a deep interrogation of the biomedical industrial complex, along with an interrogation of civilization itself. Now, from an anthropological perspective, civilization is a relatively new social form. It's only 5,000 or so years old. And in it, power and wealth are passed through the generations. It's based on conquest, extraction, and domination, not just of other peoples, but of nature itself. Now, as we interrogate, we have to separate science, a magnificent method for discovering the mechanisms of the universe, from the power structures that monetize and profit from this knowledge without regard for the health of the earth and its inhabitants. It's a tall order, I know, but we've got helpers. This is my mother, Alice. She lived with dementia for approaching 20 years, and you met her last spring in the wake of George Floyd's murder and the stark reality of the disproportionate sickness and death of Black and Brown people from COVID-19. This is Eagle, the primate of birds. Eagle signifies strength, keen, far-reaching vision, insight, and soaring flight. Eagles zoom out metaphorically and physically. Eagles make their way into the mythology and national symbolism, and their feathers are sacred medicinal objects. Now, what do Alice and the eagle have in common? Flight, special powers, and a capacity for an altered magical state. Dementia gave these qualities to Alice, like when she could look up and see my dead father when she placed her hand upon her heart. Now, the utility of this magic is left out of the biomedical formulations of disease. But before you get too nervous about my forays into the realm of magic, let me tell you how I define it. Magic refers to mysterious, naturally occurring phenomena whose mechanisms have so far eluded scientific inquiry. Radium was magic before Marie Curie discovered how it worked. Likewise, the interstitium. Remember the new human organ system discovered in 2018, consisting of a network of fluid-filled spaces? The interstitium was new to Western scientists and doctors, yet traditional Chinese medicine already focused on these fluid-filled, interconnected fascial planes, because that's the space within which the magic of qi flows. The interstitium was new only to those who saw their way as the only way and who used solely their methodologies to establish legitimacy. Now, perhaps this reminds you of European conquest of the Americas and of its colonization of so much of the so-called Old World. If it doesn't, just please try and join me here for a minute. European conquest entailed a set of people arriving in a space that was new to them and calling it a discovery. They arrived so certain that their ways were the right ones and the only ones that they used this superiority to grant themselves the license to take, to conquer, to extract, to monetize, all in the name of progress and civilization. Biomedical discovery takes place within the frameworks birthed by civilization. Researchers have to scramble for money to fund their work, for kudos, for tweets. Findings guarantee incomes and promotions. Findings lead to products which are bought and sold, all in the name of progress. Now, some products, like the vaccine we've all been waiting for, are hoarded, and distribution remains unjust because biomedicine focuses more on individual bodies than on the common good. Such individualism and biomedicine's integration with market economies derives from the stratified hierarchies of civilization. Remember, it's a system based on conquest, extraction, and domination of nature. So therefore, biomedicine works to prevent death, leaving us to search for ways to embrace, accept, or at least detoxify this natural part of life. Now, doing so leaves us free to overcome preventable, untimely deaths rooted in systemic injustice, violence, greed, and aggression. My mother's long dementia journey and watching dementia across the globe revealed a path towards detoxifying death, along with the imperative for equity. Now, detox is a three-step process. Step one, talk about death, make it natural. Alice and I spoke about death constantly. A decade before she died, she initiated rehearsals calling, "Dana, get a shower curtain or something to put under me. I don't want to make a mess." Ever the scientist, she remembered that our bodies let go after that last breath. Following her lead, after she moved from my home, I brought up death nearly every time we were together. Now, sometimes she initiated the conversations, as she did about 18 months before she died, asking me in Armenian, "Papa Ure, where's Papa?" Papa Ure. Alice used her first language, a language that I didn't learn until university. A child of refugees, Alice learned English only when she went to school. To spare me that shame and the painful legacy of genocide, she taught me English honed on Lewis Carroll and Charles Dickens. But that day, Armenian was a code. her way of showing me that I was a trusted insider who might know something of Papa's whereabouts and how to guide her to him. He's in heaven, I answered, conscious that I was using another sort of code. Alice had never believed in anything as unscientific as heaven, but her Papa had believed, and his own Papa was a deacon in the Armenian church in Constantinople. Would you like to see him? Alice nodded. You will. I was ready. When you die. Her search for Papa spoke to me of her readiness. Now, Alice hung on to our conversations about death. Once after a particularly pointed one that took place with me pushing her wheelchair along the shores of Lake Champlain, Alice unnerved others by proclaiming, I die, I die, I die. No randomized controlled trial will bring us to the deep ancestral knowledge that we can welcome death. We all hold this wisdom in our hearts, though it may be buried behind scientific rationality that scorns such magic. Now, within so many cultures, ancestors are always present, their voices heard in the wind or in the water flowing over stones. I saw this firsthand when I was studying dementia in Japan, a trip which included a homestay with Kamio-san and Michiko-san, who had been living with early onset dementia already for many years. Our time together in and out of their home allowed for intimacy and a meeting as equals, fellow humans on our respective dementia journeys. Now, had I remained a researcher, my last morning with them might not have included allowing me to enter the room that served as a shrine for their ancestors, whose constant presence normalized death and Michiko-san's liminal state. Step 2, do the work to die in peace instead of focusing all energy on staving off death, like when I brought Alice to visit her parents' grave, a place she had not visited since her mother died in 1954. We arrived at the massive cemetery, a bit bigger than Dublin's Glasnevin on a Sunday afternoon, 158 acres of graves, 640,000 square meters. The office was closed and we didn't have a plot number. We lived 6 hours away, so this was our only chance. So I got back into the truck and started driving through the grounds till it just felt right to park. And then we got out and started walking back and forth up and down the rows. And within 20 minutes, I was standing for the very first time in my life in front of my grandparents' grave. Now, was it the ancestors helping us? Magic, dumb luck, or some still unknown form of communication? Who knows? But I know that that visit let Alice make peace with her parents. It let her remember, put herself back together to die in peace. Alice also had to remember her younger brother, Antranik, born with an extra chromosome 21. During dementia, Alice burned with shame and guilt as she told me that she had been glad when her brother was put into the Wassaic State School for Mental Defectives, and that she hated waiting with him on the street corner while her mother and older sister scrubbed the floors of their railroad apartment. We went back to that New York City corner together so she could remember, so she could be kind to him. Step 3. Put measures in place to avoid artificial prolongation of life, both to make death peaceful and to repair inequity. Start seeing our normalized medical interventions through this lens. Here, Ireland's instructive. Over 50% of the people living with dementia in Ireland are transferred out of nursing homes to die in hospital after receiving a suite of expensive final life-saving measures. Imagine the schools around the world this might instead support. Even without dementia, imagine if each and every medical decision throughout our lives included asking ourselves, who does this benefit? Who is left out? From whose labor was the wealth amassed that allows me to afford this? And whose poorly paid labor is making this intervention possible? And let's go back here now to dementia to remember that care homes rely upon flows of workers from poor to wealthy nations, from the global south to the global north. These essential workers, displaced by our unjust world order, leave behind their older relatives. I saw this firsthand in Armenia, where most older adults lived without any family in country because unemployment forced the younger generations to Moscow to find work. Now, when Alice was kicked out of her second memory care home in New York, I was told that her only option was a high-cost nursing home where her bodily functions could be attended to and monitored. Instead, I chose to bring her back to Vermont, where love and care could include remembering, and it could include refusing basic medical care like antibiotics. Alice lived well here for another 3 years until a tooth abscess, treated only with pain relief, let her die gently. Her 2 daughters, 7 of her 8 grandchildren, and a host of essential workers who loved her dearly by her side. We're meant to live and die in community. When a tree dies in a forest, it remains part of the community, sustaining the earth, the other plants, animals, bacteria, fungus, an entire ecosystem. So like eagles, circling above the forest, we must zoom out and extend our view and our community to include the entire planet. Flying high adds to this expansion a long view of time. It lets us touch our ancestors and those who will follow us. This connects us to our hearts, where we all know that we can learn to welcome death. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dana, for that beautiful paper and fantastically timed too. Thank you so much. I would like to invite now Mary to give her response.
Thanks so much for this paper, Dana. It was absolutely beautiful, as Gillian said, very thought-provoking, beautifully told and illustrated, and heartfelt as well. I think very personal. You know, to bring it back to you know, the kind of vocabulary we've been using, it is a meditation on the fourth age but from a very, very interesting perspective that I think I'll try and put some sort of a frame on that. Your paper brings together in this highly personal and unique way some of the themes that we as a group have touched on over the past year: fears of dying alongside the determination to sustain longer life, a determination that is underpinned by great privilege, realized mainly in the rich countries of the world, and within these rich societies only unevenly. Aging as a privilege for some then, when it should be a basic human right for all. The viability of the right to aging and longer life as entangled with the question of resources and complicity with market economies, or embeddedness in market economies, the question of who has access to these resources, the question of whose labor goes into maintaining the privilege of aging, and the related question of what happens to the right to aging of those laborers. So these are just some of the issues that you have raised here. Your paper also has a historical dimension. The determination to sustain longer life is framed historically by a concept of progress that stretches back to the early modern era of discovery, conquest, and exploitation of nature and other peoples, one based on the ingrained civilizational and very gendered superiority of the old world, the after echoes of which can be heard in the systemic health inequity that exists on a global level today, and also more immediately within local societies and communities. The pandemic has brought out this deep unfairness in sharp relief. Now is the moment for wealthy societies to reflect on their privilege, which is not a natural right, but one that came and still comes at the cost of the health of others within and beyond our own communities and national borders. Your paper is also a call for new imaginings, new ideas, the utility of magic, for example. How about that, right? And it is a call to action around death. And all of this belongs together, because new imaginings, new ideas about death. And perhaps we need to return to ancestral heritage in order to get inspiration. It asks us, or you ask us, to each of us, to detoxify our view of death by talking about it as the natural part of life and living that it is, by imagining it differently. And ancestral heritage and a connection to magic is one powerful way of doing this. We should reconceive death with imagination and curiosity then, welcoming it as the mysterious rite of passage it is, rather than throwing more and more resources into staving it off. And again, the question is, for whom? Staving it off for whom precisely? The third step is pragmatic. You suggest that we should decide to share the resources we put into the artificial prolongation of life more fairly with our fellow humans on a global scale. Now, so I'm going to move to maybe framing this a little bit from my own perspective. Much of what you say, Dana, seems to me to come from the position of what Michael Rothberg calls the implicated subject. So the concept of implication tries to capture how subjects in the present situate themselves vis-a-vis a difficult past beyond ideas of inherited victimization or perpetration. So Rothberg writes about the Holocaust originally, but in his work on multi-directional memory is very well known, and implication builds on that. Implication has both synchronic and diachronic dimensions which can intersect. The synchronic aspect captures how present-day implicated subjects may be aligned with power without themselves being direct agents of harm. Rothberg calls these subjects beneficiaries. The diachronic aspect captures how implicated subjects can also be descendants of systems of injustice and inequality rooted in the past. The intersection of past and present positions of implication can result in what Rothberg calls entanglement or complex implication, which is essentially a multifaceted subjectivity that makes neat binary classification of subject positions pretty much impossible. Scrutinizing such entanglements of self at the intersection of past and present can help illuminate unrecognized background conditions that permeate the present. And I think this is what your paper is doing, Dana. Rothberg argues that a more nuanced understanding of the implicated self in entanglements of past and present could pave the way for a transnational, diverse, and multilateral interpersonal politics based on empathy with and greater understanding of the past and present suffering of others. In making the case for reconceiving aging as a basic human right for all, rather than a privilege for the few, your paper gives ethical voice to just this complex entanglement in the name of solidarity and community. It fuses the perspective of the descendant of migrant ancestors from Armenia, who were traumatized by racial persecution, genocide, and uprooting, with the perspective of the critical citizen beneficiary of a wealthy nation, to offer a relational view of dying and death that is immediate and yet global. This view starts from the ground up, with consciously self-situating individual subjects who position themselves with regard to structural injustice and violence taking place in the present, again, beyond the limitations of victim-perpetrator binaries. Your roadmap for detoxifying death by embracing it in an alternative way that emphasizes community, imagination, magic, etc., rather than isolation, profit, monetizing, power, acceptance rather than denial, and the sharing of resources rather than hoarding them for a minority globally, seems to be very much in this vein of implication. And when you were talking about that, zooming out to a global perspective and thinking widely, I really again had that great sense of resonance with this particular concept. So thank you very much, Dana.
Thanks very much for that reflection, Mary. That was a fascinating compliment to Dana's paper.
At the beginning of your paper, of your really wonderful paper, Dana, thank you so much. It's so poetic and has so much positive energy. You were connecting nature and the destruction of the planet to a person with dementia. You said it's magical, and it's there's also some kind of wonder in there. And we have helpers, you said. Do you see people, where do you see the connection between the earth, even when the eagle, you said, you mentioned that too, but do you have any other examples of when you observed your mother and with your relationship with your mother, the way you saw this interconnectedness between the planet and human beings through dementia? Because it seemed you had a lot of examples for that, and I would be interested in those.
Thank you. That's a great question. And the way I've gotten to look at it is that everyone, dementia and any other form of cognitive diversity, including my uncle with trisomy 21, they're telling us what's broken about our earth. Or it's not our earth, it's really more what's broken about our social systems. And so that by really listening to diverse voices, and it is the mental health realm, the disabilities, cognitive disabilities, and dementia. All of those really help us understand what's not working in our society. I think about how my mother couldn't deal with sirens driving by. It just made her jump out of her skin. Or I think about how one of the physicians I knew of in Japan who was working on dementia, he found that people who lived in villages that were still intact and hadn't changed never got lost when they were wandering, whereas people who lived in places that had altered throughout their lives, they'd head out their door and then they'd be standing in front of some building, unable to, like, what's going on? And my body tells me something else should be here. And so for us, I really think that we can orient ourselves towards thinking of every interaction, not just with cognitive diversity, as being an opportunity to learn how we can tip ourselves back into balance.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. A couple of questions here, Dana, in the chat. Linda wonders whether there's any place for grief in this context of detoxifying death.
Oh, that's such a, I think grief and joy are so close to one another. And that even the scientists who have studied for us, Paul Ekman, emotion on the face, when you look at the face of someone who's in the throes of grieving, their facial expression captures both profound joy and extreme loss. The two are connected. But if you don't do the work of making that connection through death, you're left only with the grief. Whereas if you just face it head on, it's transformative. I was speaking with a colleague yesterday who had just accompanied her mother through the death journey, and she described just watching joy wash over her face after that last breath, going from her forehead down the rest of her face. And with my mother, dementia is progressive. So for the last 6 months of her life, she had such a like, what the hell is going on expression on her face, except for if we drew her out into a smile. The minute she died, she looked like herself again, the beautiful Alice that we all knew. And that's a vital part of just kind of staying connected to both the joy and the grief at once, because they're two sides of the same coin.
My question is really, you talked about the need for community and for a relational sense of togetherness and justice, which I think is very, very interesting and important. However, the 3 steps, as you described them, are, nevertheless, I would argue, highly individualistic and privileged. To be able to travel to the graveyard takes, it requires certain assets, money, privilege, etc. And many people die very miserable deaths, and they cannot follow your roadmap.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you reconcile your broader social justice perspective
Mm-hmm.
with this message that you have just relayed to us? So it's a bit of a challenging question, but I thought I might say it.
No, it's a great question. And it's actually something I've been in dialogue about with one of my colleagues whose father died of COVID right at the beginning of the pandemic in another country. And their traditions were to bring him back 12-hour drive away to the ancestral burial grounds. And she didn't have the level of privilege that I had, but this was such a compelling thing that she had to actually break pandemic rules to make sure and honor her father. And so we all have to grapple with just what we're going to do, but maybe what it is. I mean, I think of India right now. Maybe what it requires is for all of us with our privilege to divest and give in the context for the people that don't have the privilege to drive. I think it is up to us to take stop hoarding the wealth so that it isn't a matter of privilege. But you're right, at this moment, not everyone can do it. But then let's go back to some other situations where people have it set up so they're already close to ancestors and not part of this crazy world order, where everybody disperses thousands of miles in order to get jobs. So it's sort of, I think you're right. We've got to blend these ideas with what we have in place in terms of our structures. And some of doing that is going to be absolutely requires a divestment by those who have privilege to give those same opportunities for people who don't have it.
Desmond, you've got a question, and also E had a question, which is to do with the relationship between spirit and religion, Dana. And I don't know if you could maybe say a little bit about that too, and then we'll come to Des's question last.
Yeah. As an anthropologist, spirituality and religion are completely separate. Spirituality is something existential, and all societies have ways of making sense of things. And that's what spirituality is about. And that is the ancestral thing that I'm talking about. Whereas religion is the particular patterns that a society has developed. And that's because I could always see everything in terms of spirituality. I didn't mind, I didn't feel like I was breaching Alice's adult beliefs, which scorned organized religion. When I was a kid, we didn't attend anything as a family. I went to shul with my Jewish neighbors, Methodist Sunday school with the people across the street. I went to Quaker summer camp. We just sort of had this big, expansive religious upbringing. So I internalized that religion, they were all the same somehow or another. So I hope that helps, that spirituality is this universal thing and religion is the particulars. And at the time of death and dying, we all want to honor where someone is in terms of their habits and practices of their religion. But by focusing on the spirit, you can just go into those particulars without violation of what the religious meaning that someone has to hold to feel safe.
Thanks very much. And we'll just take one final question, and then I think we really will have to move on. Just Desmond, your question, please.
Thank you very much, Janine. Thank you so much, Dana. Very impacted by your presentation. And obviously I'm coming from a biomed background, but some of the two words that kind of came out from kind of synthesis in my head of what you were saying were really this issue of how we deal with vulnerability and whether we kind of turn our backs on displaying that or even tolerating that within ourselves, and then therefore in its visibility to others. But then also this kind of myth that we are to pursue perfection, and not least in the context of scientific discovery and and even quasi-religious, where we see kind of our God as perfect, and we may not be perfect, but we're always told to strive toward perfection. So there's kind of a dissonance that comes with this allure of perfection, and at the same time, the feet of clay vulnerability that we kind of eschew to protect us from the downside of that. And from what you were describing there was, to me, kind of this kind of balance of the personal and the community in terms of perfection, in terms of industrial, quests, and then the socialization of living together. And there was kind of a, I'm probably not explaining it very well, but I'm trying to kind of contextualize that in the mind of a scientist as well as the mind of a non-scientist. But thank you very much. Thank you.
You're welcome. It is really interesting to work at bridging those worlds, and I think there's so much good stuff that happens when we're really talking to each other about those things. I think that perfection is a cultural construction, and a very, very dangerous one. And we're pushed towards it because it's profitable. It makes us always striving. Whereas nature is not perfect. Nature is variable. Nature goes back and forth with balance and imbalance, and then will right itself, and recover. So, and when you were speaking, it reminded me of the earlier question from Ula about what does dementia teach us. The way I started looking at it was that dementia releases us from the social constructions that we've internalized, and then we just sort of go back to something that's not perfect and that's very humble, and that I think that humility will get us very, very far, and with all of this, and humility can work well in science too, especially when it's disengaged from all the pressures that the post-industrial economy puts on it. So thank you for that.
Thanks so much, Dana, for all those thoughtful replies. Now, I think we will move on now and take our next speaker, Tara Burr, who's a cultural policy specialist and the arts program manager at Age and Opportunity, and also artistic director at the Belltown Festival. So she has been extremely busy. There's a fantastic program for that festival, which runs all this month. And Tara's going to talk to us today about subverting and celebrating older age through the arts. So I'll pass the floor to you.
It's great to be here, and what I wanted to talk about was how the arts contributes to our interpretation and perceptions of the world through its various discourses, because the arts obviously is a discourse as an expression, a communication, a point of view, something that seeks to shape and influence other people's opinions. So I'm going to be specifically talking about how the arts can contribute to an alternative and more dynamic models of age and aging, and how it contributes to thinking and knowledge, as far as I'm concerned, around ways to age. So I hope some of you will have noted the completely offensive to some people and hopefully tongue-in-cheek to other people title of this paper, Die, Old People Die, which is not at all mine or Age and Opportunities or Bealtaina's, but is a UK company called Ridiculismus, another brilliant name, that's the theatre company. And I just really like it because I guess for me, it represents a kind of an attitude, a kind of gritty realism, a 3D view of aging. It's a kind of a punk aesthetic, I suppose. So I really like that. So I'm going to speak again about how the arts contributes to how we think about aging, and specifically in terms of Bealtaine, Ireland's arts festival, which celebrates the arts and creativity as we age, which hopefully all of you know, and which is on right now. The whole month of May, happens every year. It's about balancing the celebratory aspects of the festival with the more challenging and complex, darker aspects of aging. So it's getting that balance right. Also going to talk about subverting representations of older people through, I suppose, unusual or surprising projects. And then the kind of semiotics that we use through our communications around the festival, and that's really important for us. So that's what I want to talk about. So next slide, please. So just a bit of an introduction to how we use the arts in age and opportunity. And I use that word deliberately. As you know, instrumentality is a very politicized word, and rightly so, because obviously in the arts, it's about using the arts to achieve something that's non-artistic. So it's very much against the intrinsic art for art's sake movement, which I would be very supportive of. And I think I've commented on this before, but there are two uses really that we make of the arts and age and opportunity. And one is, well, I would say is not a use, is the intrinsic values of the arts, which is about creating access to the arts. So that's the first thing that we want to do in relation to older people, as to widen the access, create those opportunities. And then the second one is about an extrinsic or instrumental wish to address ageism through the arts. So those are the two ways that we use it. And ultimately, it's about creating representation in the arts for older people, championing the creativity of older people, and supporting older audiences, older artists, and organizations who want to work with older people. So essentially, we want to raise the game in relation to what some countries, in particular America, calls creative aging. We don't use that term so much here. It's more around the arts and older people, but it's about raising that game. And Bealtaine, which is the focus of this, is the flowering of all of that work that we do, and hopefully the flowering for other organizations around Ireland, all voluntarily organized, of their work throughout the year. It's taking that one moment in May to showcase the very best, and not always the very best, I suppose, the challenges of aging. That for me is what's interesting. So I view the festival like this. It has an expression. It is a discourse. We want to influence how people think about aging through it. I suppose I'd also mention that the festival creates a social space, which is really important for that discourse, to reinforce it, for people to exchange views about it, et cetera, et cetera. So we might move on to the next slide now, please. So I just wanted to, I mean, certainly the majority of our projects tend to be on the celebratory side and about underlining opportunities. So I'm going to start with those. So these respectively images represent projects that we're mostly involved with this year as part of the festival, and the kind of concepts that they're representing are celebration, hospitality, welcome, inclusion, solidarity, celebrating long careers, exchanging information, welcoming new communities into Ireland, and intergenerational exchange and learning. So, for example, on the top left is a project with St. Joseph's care setting in Shankill, which is one of the few, if not the only, dedicated dementia care centre in Ireland. And it was a project by a visual arts organisation called Fairland Collective, who wanted to create a party with the residents of the centre and create literally the delf and the tableware for the party with them through craft workshops. So there was this party held literally on the cups and plates that have been made by the residents. So very affirmative, very endorsing, very celebratory. Literally, there was a celebration. On the right-hand side, the Kaliaka is a really interesting newish group of older artists, mostly visual artists, but also a writer and a musician, who have come together to exchange learning, to exchange reflections on their long and successful careers, to plan for the future, and to support each other. And they've made a film about that, and we're going to show the film in the festival, but they're a really interesting group, and lots is going to develop there, I think. Then we have a dance project below, which was based on the theme of welcome, which was our festival theme last year, and looking at welcoming in the most mundane sense of people into your house, but also into the country. And that was a dance project with older people. And then on the left is another dance project, which is about intergenerational exchange. Instant Dissidence is the name of the company. Rita Marcallo is in the photograph, and she's been using the seasons, the 4 seasons, to work through issues to do with trying to live lightly on the earth. It's called As If Trying Not to Own the Earth, pardon me. She's learning how to grow food and preserve food with a group of older people, and they are learning to dance from her all online. So these are the kind of celebratory projects that we run. The next slide, please. So then, as I said, I think it's really important to have this, I suppose, grittiness and 3D representation of aging. I think that that's just a way of, I suppose, underlying or creating a sense of acceptance, I suppose. And Dana, you talked about the importance of talking about mortality with your mother. So in fact, these images represent another festival that we used to do called Samhain, which we don't do anymore, mostly for resources reasons. But that was like a parallel corollary festival, if you like, to Bealtaine. Samhain, as some of you will know, or all of you will know, marks the beginning of winter in the way that Bealtaine marks the spring, summer. Two very different stages in our lives. But now I think the idea is just to kind of incorporate themes of Samhain into the festival. So we have here themes like the neglect of the state in relation to care, something you mentioned as well, Dana, states in general, and the devaluing of carers, mortality and facing death, the lifetime impact of discrimination on sexual grounds on us as we get older, in particular, the impact of that, dementia and illness, and how it impacts. So those are the themes here, and the projects are by Sean Dunn, as a playwright on the top left, and he's written, there's a film and a play called Who's Gonna Drive You Home is the film, and I've to Mind Her is the play, and it's about a very young carer who has to look after his mother, but actually can't cope with that anymore. And I think it shines a light on not only the kind of neglect of carers, but the age, people who are just not equipped to look after their parents. On the right hand side then, or the middle, is an image of a death cafe, which we ran with the Irish Hospice Foundation, which is about obviously coming to terms with talking about death. We have Rory O'Neill, a very well-known LGBTQIA+ activist, who is chairing our discussion on the experiences of older people who are from the LGBTQIA+ community. We have a play then by Michelle Reid on the lower right-hand side, which is about her mother. It's a one-person play by Michelle about her mother who has dementia, and it's her really a love letter to her mother, but also detailing the challenges of that for the family. And we have Patrick Frayne, a journalist, who's chairing a discussion on care as well. So care and the politics of care is really big this year for us in the festival. Patrick's a former carer himself, which not everyone will know unless you read his book. So if we can move on to the next slide, please. And so this is just exploring themes which are not surprising at all to most of us, but are surprising to some people, I suppose, in relation to age and aging. So we have sex and sexuality here. We have the idiosyncrasy, kind of ribald humor. We have diversity. We have freedom and rebellion, and we have children, I suppose. So by that I mean we commissioned a theatre production again from Sean Dunn on the top left-hand side called Everybody Sings, which was about the sexuality of older people, and that was a few years ago. It was a really beautiful project that involved it was a live theatre project with a choir and a film, and I think just those things are just part of human life. Obviously don't stop and are important to continue to showcase. With The Windy Lady by Pom Boyd, and a really, really funny theatre practitioner, musing about COVID. We ran this last year. She made 4 videos about COVID, and it's her walking around her flat, musing on the strangeness of life through her own kind of idiosyncratic lens. Little John Nee is a writer and performer below her, very absurd, a kind of absurdist sense of humor, and he's part of the festival this year. We have the Bee Bandits in the middle. They're a gang of older people who designed their own jackets, who created a gang, kind of gang-like jackets, and cycled around Dublin. This is kind of representing freedom and rebellion. And then we do a lot of intergenerational work. So again, these are not surprising. They shouldn't be surprising, but I think it's just really important to have not what you might generally expect, because we see so much of what we might expect. So next slide, please. And so this is kind of our communications around the festival, really key. I think we've talked in this series before about the representations of older people, and we've all seen, you know, even very, you know, perfectly lovely images, bank ads, for example, of you know, older people taking out loans or getting, you know, divesting themselves of their mortgages or whatever it is that they're doing, and they're lovely and well dressed and very proper, and I would say very often conservative images, and not the model of aging that I want to pursue and am pursuing. So we wanted something that was quite cool, quite party-ish, stylish, absolutely really important, and just not the kind of twin set and pearls. Nothing wrong with that, but that is one view of aging that is quite common still, and not necessarily images of I try and avoid images of people at classical musical concerts. Again, absolutely nothing wrong with classical music. It's an art form and it's part of the festival, but there tends to be an association, as we know, of older people with a very particular traditional art forms and not others. So I really liked this photo sheet. Pom Boyd is actually featuring in that on the left-hand side, and we were really going for Patti Smith look, and I think she really achieved it. In fact, she dresses like that all the time, so she just kind of literally rocked up and looked like that. So for me, that's really key to the festival. So I'm actually coming to a close now, if you want to move on to the last slide. So really, I just wanted to talk about how, you know, obviously art in and of itself, there are lots of messages depending on who the artist is and what the artwork is. But through the festival, through kind of direct and indirect means, I think that there's a very strong message around alternative ways to age. And I think it's through the kind of light, the balance of the light and dark, and in particular, I suppose, that balance, the aspect of a kind of real, you know, lack of grey washing, I suppose, to use that term. I would hate to think that we ever grey washed anything in terms of sanitizing it, through using, I hope, subversive or engaging subversive projects, using surprising, you know, themes, and really taking care with our imagery. So I'll leave it at that.
Thanks so much for that, Tara. And I hope we'll all have an opportunity to dip into the Bealtaine Festival, as there's so much going on there. Thank you. Now I'd like to invite Linda to just respond to the paper, and then we can take questions.
Thanks very much, Gillian, and thanks very much for the paper, Tara. That was really, really interesting. I'm very used to reading about these kind of interventions, so from the safe space of my desk. So it's really interesting for me to hear your perspective from the, you know, the perspective of the organizer, really. And I think you did that really well. One of the things that really struck me was kind of, you were talking about ideas of changing representations of age through the visuals, and you know, in particular those striking communications imageries. And I think, you know, they really are very striking, and really very vivid and great. But it did strike me that they were also quite overwhelmingly white. And I just wanted to ask you a bit about that, and how Bealtaine is actually kind of marketing itself. And I know you said that, you know, that there is kind of a nod to diversity, or diversity is included in there in the programme. But I just wondered, you know, when you start looking at how audiences are responding, or what kind of audiences are responding to Bealtaine, are you actually seeing diversity in there? Because I think that's really interesting from the perspective of sort of the Irish aging population. So that was kind of one of my first questions really for you. The other thing I was interested in is this intergenerational aspect, because I didn't know about the Bealtaine Festival. Now I've been living abroad for a number of years, so this is my first time kind of being back in Ireland, and engaging with the Irish cultural context in this. So and I'd gone online to have a look at the Bealtaine Festival, and I saw, oh, there's loads of things I'd love to get involved in here. But when I looked at the when I looked at kind of who the festival is for, or what it's about, You know, and I think you've mentioned this yourself too. It was, you know, older people, older audiences, older artists, and organizations who want to work. And I kind of went, oh, okay, it's not for me. And I was wondering about that, because, you know, when you were talking about the intra-generational aspect in some of the events, and I think that's really important, and great. But I really did wonder about the perspective of opening that up, but that might be my misreading. So I'd be interested in hearing a bit more about that too. And the third area where I thought it would be great to hear a bit more on is how you actually measure the impact then of these interventions and what they do. You know, it would be just really interesting to hear that. So they were my thoughts, but really, really interesting, super initiative.
Sure. So just to take the diversity one first. I mean, you're absolutely right. That those images are all very white, and in fact, our festival would be a very white festival for sure. Our audience is absolutely. I'm not sure actually if I've ever seen someone who is not white at a festival event. So obviously, I haven't seen anyone in the last year. But I think it's something that. I mean, funny enough, I would say diversity for us has been in the past men, just trying to actually attract men because it's predominantly women that we attract. But anyway, we've taken steps, I think, to address that, and we're actually this year it's more diverse, the festival. Now it's certainly not diverse in a way that we want it to be, but it is definitely more diverse, and we have a kind of a conscious policy in relation to that, and I think it'll be different again next year. But an interesting thing on that anyway for me too is that, you know, we would have networks with MRCI, Migrant Rights Centre, and other kind of migrant related, you know, networks and support groups. And that's just obviously one network in terms of a potential, you know, partnership. But there are not yet, from what they tell us, a cohort of older people in those populations, in their groups anyway, as yet. It's still quite a young profile, or certainly under 50. And Age and Opportunity takes 50 as the beginning of older age. So there you are. But it's something that we're consciously working on. And then the second thing is who the festival is for. So the festival, in fact, is for anyone. But I had mentioned those organizations as part of our development, rather than our development work focuses on artists, on audiences and organizations, rather than the festival. So that's the development work is kind of separate to that. But we've often had a debate within Age and Opportunity about whether we should focus on, you know, 50 plus, which is the official, or we should be focusing on the life course, the whole of our lives, because obviously
there would seem to be huge potential there, especially around breaking down stereotypes and kind of reshaping and changing things, you know.
Yeah, I think so. But that's definitely a continuous discussion. But the festival, I do think, is for all ages, and tends to be very intergenerational in terms of who comes to it. So it's probably 60-40 in terms of older, younger. So that's a pretty good mix, and I think it's one that we're happy with. And then just in relation to measuring impact, my colleague Mary Harkin may be here at the moment in the audience somewhere. She is the policy and research person with Age and Opportunity, and she helps us to conduct an evaluation every year of the festival. So, you know.
So it's just like a questionnaire type thing, or what way do you measure then the shift in ideas? Or
it's a questionnaire to both the people who come to the festival and also to the organizations who partner with us all around the country. And we're asking them all sorts of things about their experience, what they'd like to see more of. And we're now beginning to ask them more about, going back to diversity, beginning to ask them more about which communities they represent or identify with, which is not something we would have done in the past. So we're beginning to start to map that a bit more. And actually, Dana has just reminded me through the chat function of a project which I should have mentioned as well that we did 2 years ago called Aber Sama, and it was with a North African singer who was doing this actually hit all our, if you want to be tokenistic about boxes, who was doing a project with a men's shed group. So it was, whoa, not a white person and not a woman. And that was a really wonderful project where she was telling a story of how she assimilated into Ireland and how her family, her experience in Ireland, and they were telling stories about their experiences of coming back to Ireland. Many of them had worked abroad in America, Australia, and the UK. So that was a really lovely project. But it's not something we have done a lot of as yet. We've done quite a few projects in relation to the LGBTQIA community. So depending on how you define diversity.
Thanks very much, Tara, and thanks, Linda, as well. I'm very happy to welcome everyone back from the short comfort break to the last presentation of the day, and that is by Desmond O'Neill, Professor in Medical Gerontology at TCD and long-standing advocate of collaboration and cooperation with the arts and humanities, as is evident in the title of today's paper, Cultural Gerontology and Medical Humanities, Opportunities for Mutual Learning. And I can see the slides are all ready to go. So I'll hand the floor to you, Desmond.
Great, thanks very much. Look, it's been fantastic to be here. All these sessions have been really wonderful. My imagination's been stretched, my beliefs have been stretched, and I've seen new ways of expressing. I think the interest here is, and it's going to be a real interest to us when we bring together all of these various talks and discussions, is how do we move forward further with interdisciplinarity or indeed transdisciplinarity. Let's not get caught up on that particular phraseology. And I think I've been involved with medical and health humanities for about 30 years now. And I do think there's some really interesting parallels. And I think there are opportunities arising from looking at how these sectors work. And both have been working for millennia, almost certainly, but perhaps in a formalized way, probably since the middle of the last century. We're fortunate to be working in what must be the richest stage of life. As we say in gerontology, we're born copies, but die as originals. And I have to say, there was never a second thought for me. Whatever way I was fortunate in my family background to see aging as interesting, that there was no other thing I really ever thought about working in. But it's a real challenge to explain the complexity of this richness. And I'm often think of St. Augustine talking about time, that it's very much similar to the way we might imagine aging, in that if nobody asks me, I know what it is, but if I wish to explain it to him who asks me, I do not know. But of course, the truth is indeed out there, and I think we've developed an understanding of the complexities and challenges of understanding through these series of webinars, and indeed looking forward to September as well. Now, when I look at cultural gerontology or humanities and arts and aging, or indeed medical humanities, I sometimes wish that we'd relabeled it the big picture, because what it is, it's about standing back, it's about liberating ourselves from the shackle of whatever, as Foucault would call the medical gaze, but there's a sociologist gaze, there's a psychologist gaze, but I think a slight danger sometimes is not also realizing that we also need to be in the mix as well. So it's standing back and looking, it's inquiring, it's interrogating, but it's also, if we're going to show our value in terms of humanities and arts with others, we must also be willing to have interrogation coming back the same way as well. And indeed, I'm going to give two examples where I see the challenge of humanities approaches to aging that don't actually think through, hold on a minute, what's going on in all the various knowledge of aging. And one is this very well-meaning book by two literary scholars about late life creativity. And they take four composers and look at something we know from Jean Cohen and others, that late life creativity is great, not in spite of aging, but because of aging. And 3/4 of the book is great. No contest around Richard Strauss, about Giuseppe Verdi or Olivier Messiaen. All their late works truly phenomenal. But then the next thing is they bring in Benjamin Britten and his death in Venice, and they ascribe the creativity impulse from his heart failure and stroke, and he was only in his late 50s. And again, the issue here is around an interrogation and saying, hold on a minute, heart failure and stroke is not premature aging, and it's a throwback to outdated failure models of aging. The next one was a paper in Medical Humanities where in vain I pointed out to the editor, who decided to ignore my, as is her right, my challenge with this paper, where they characterized parents being estranged from adult children as particularly a phenomenon of later life. And in fact, parents, there's no evidence whatsoever in the gerontological literature that this is the case. And indeed, I would have to say from my own practice, I would see reconciliation, possibly the opposite trend. So it is important that we have an opportunity for this intermingling. Now, the good news is the danger is we sometimes don't see what's there. And the very first issue of the very first volume of the Journal of Gerontology had a paper by John Draper, who was a professor of English literature at the University of West Virginia. So I think from the get-go, you can see that in gerontology, there is an openness. There was very early on, considering the first journal's 1946 history of gerontology, and widespread from all fields of gerontology. This is from health gerontology. Joseph Freeman brought together this wonderful volume of aging and history and literature to show that there's always been an interest, that there's always much to learn from philosophy, poetry, theater, and drama, but that its formalization almost certainly from the middle of the last century. And indeed, we can see that in nearly all journals on aging now, there's a section on medical humanities, European Geriatric Medicine since 2019, JAGS, the key American geriatrics journal from last year, the Gerontologist, long-standing, and indeed there's Age, Culture and Humanities, its own journal. But even beyond that, the Lancet Impact Factor 60, and of course, one of the things I'll come to in the end is one of our enemies of promise in terms of interdisciplinarity is perhaps an emphasis on issues such as impact factors in promotions, etc. But the Lancet Impact Factor 60 has carried a very significant amount of humanities and arts related to aging. And indeed, from this cover, we can see how this proactive approach, this broad holistic view, including humanities and arts, has led them to put this quote on their cover, that aging, most often framed in negative terms, questioning whether health services, welfare provision, and economic growth are sustainable, argue instead that instead of being portrayed as a problem, increased human longevity should be a cause for celebration. So there is a very significant opportunity here, and indeed an opportunity I think that's perhaps not well enough capitalized on to date, of bringing together the area of medical humanities or medical and health humanities, which again has been there since antiquity, but probably formalized through the work of Pellegrino and others, and indeed has a broad range of areas of its scholarship and significant amount of journals in medical humanities, arts and health, and arts therapies. And this allows us to generate parallels such as cultural gerontology, humanistic gerontology, and narrative gerontology. And indeed, we're all here today on behalf of the Insight and the open arms of the Wellcome Foundation. And it really is, I think, important for us to realize we have opportunities here. And indeed, I think hopefully the next generations of the major textbooks, and I know this is happening with Tom Cole's textbook, which Kate de Medeiros is co-editing, will include much more from health gerontology as discussants or contributors, and indeed, hopefully the next edition of cultural gerontology, that really important textbook, which had very slender input from health gerontology, might include this as well. But just as in terms of cultural gerontology and medical humanities, we need to think about, how do we develop this to be a serious interdisciplinary academic pursuit with high scholarship values, and that it's not a doorway to dilettantism all the while reminding ourselves that Nietzsche and Adorno both thought that part of Wagner's success was indeed his dilettantism, but I don't think it's something we're totally encouraging in this space here. So the challenge, and we can learn much, I think, from medical humanities, arts and health, and those other spectrum, where people have been teasing out the ideas of interdisciplinarity and how we move it forward. And I think one of the ways is to start looking at interdisciplinarity itself. And we've taken a particular interest in our own research group in doing bibliometric analysis of authorship in the medical humanities. And it's something we're hoping to move on now to cultural gerontology, humanities and arts. And the question is, in our scholarship, are we breaking cross-field boundaries, or are we maintaining disciplinary divides? We've also undertaken work on this in medical history, and the medical history bibliometric analysis very much parallels that of the medical humanities. And what we find is that the majority of authors or papers are single authors with scant indication of joint working. Now, we do have a sense from various meetings we've been at that there is more joint working than under the surface, and I'll come to that, what I'd call multidisciplinary. But arts and humanities, about a third, healthcare, a third, both only 14% and unclear 16%. So there's clearly an opportunity. An area that's hugely neglected and something that we think could be developed more is what's known as the scholar's courtesy or acknowledgements. And these were absent in 66% and present in a third. But of overall acknowledgements, 55 out of nearly 600 papers, only 8% of the total indicated joint working. And in single author papers, 5% of the total, in the total 600 papers, indicated joint working. So look, there's an opportunity here, and perhaps in a metric that might yet be developed, and there's been some interest in this in the bibliometric and scientific merit area, in looking at the importance of acknowledgements, because so little is done necessarily by single authors anymore. So our key in many ways is in gerontology, and I'll take my example from the Gerontological Society of America, where I'm currently the chair of the Humanities, Arts and Cultural Gerontology panel. Delighted to have colleagues like Ulla Krieberneck involved with me, and trying to build bridges with these two important reservoirs of resources in aging studies in arts and humanities, ENAS and NANAS. And I think what we sometimes forget is that when you're building a bridge, bridges cost money. So there's an opportunity and other costs in developing bridges, but bridges must be built. And I think incorporating what is needed to build that bridge is part of our work together. So a very nice paper on this from somebody who's been a long worker on this, Andy Achenbaum. I direct people towards it. In 2020, after when GSA has been around for 75 years, well, what were the options for the humanities and arts in this very, very large society, very large meeting, up to 40 parallel sessions? And the first thing is to expand its intellectual and institutional presence within GSA. And thanks to the work of previous chairs, I have absolutely no doubt that its presence is increased. And indeed, this year, for the first time, we've actually worked with the academic element of teaching, the Academy of Gerontological Education in higher institutions, on both a symposium and a pre-conference workshop. So we're formalizing our linkages. Secondly, we should fervently challenge the gerontological imagination. And again, it's interesting, and we'll come to this towards the end. So many of my colleagues say there's not enough, and I'm going, there's as many symposia on other things. We get keynote speakers, I feel we have to be careful that we don't make a more special place for ourselves than other elements of gerontology. And lastly, to forge partnerships outside GSA, and that's something we're very keen to do with ENAS and NANAS. But there are challenges. For example, I think the sort of things we need to be thinking about is promote scholarship on barriers and facilitators to interdisciplinarity. And issues such as cost, such as styles of authorship, such as the routes to promotion. So, for example, to go to a NANAS, North American Network on Aging Studies, the last one held in person, was $350 Canadian dollars in total. It included your meals and tea and coffee. Again, a relatively small organization without a major advocacy piece. To go to the Gerontological Society of America, on the other hand, is you're talking about a registration fee of $600. You don't get meals and coffee for that. You've got your hotels, you've got your travel. So, but you're also buying into a larger structure that includes advocacy and a range of other options. The second thing is to rethink promotional incentives in the disciplines involved. And one of the constant comebacks to us is that in many disciplines, single author papers are prioritized in terms of merit and promotion. And really, if departments want to get into interdisciplinary work, that can no longer, there has to be some hard thinking about that. And again, the authorial incontinence, however, in much of medicine and healthcare also needs to be rethought with some respect for the guidelines in other disciplines. I think it's really worthwhile, and we've seen this through these workshops, and I think we're going to see it in the new Tom Cole book, where each chapter has a discussant from the parallel discipline, whether it's humanities and arts or whether it's gerontology. And again, we do this in our medical humanities seminars, where if we've got a historian speaking, we'll have a physician with an interest in history as the discussant, and vice versa. Greater use and recognition of acknowledgements, short author biographies in journals so that we know what's the background and how did the author come to this point to be discussing this. I think as a group, we need to be doing less they don't care about us. If you go to the gerontology meetings, the biology people say they don't include enough biological gerontology. If you go to the sociology, they say, oh, the geriatricians, they don't do enough social gerontology. So I think we get in there, we're a presence, we offer opportunities, we link in. And lastly, and most importantly, I think, and I'm hopefully really pleased to be part of this project because it's about developing funding platforms. And how do we get there? Well, Callard and Fitzgerald in their wonderful book talk about the progress from inquisitive unidisciplinarity, occult multidisciplinarity, where you're bouncing off other people but not necessarily acknowledging them. You go to multidisciplinarity, where you work alongside, but you're not really interrogating and giving yourself a challenge to really question the fundamentals of what you're doing. And lastly, interdisciplinarity. And they talk about the challenge of reviewers, the challenge of funding, the ethical challenge of having a PhD student where their postdoc future is not so obvious, but it's a good life strategy, interdisciplinarity. This book is free to download. I also think a book that's very helpful in parallel, and it could be useful to develop a similar model for aging studies. A nice book, Research Methods in Health Humanities. There's a bit of narcissistic element of narcissism of small differences in the first chapter about the difference between medical and health humanities, but otherwise it's very good in introducing to people to close reading and other methodologies. Just a sign of us working together and the opportunities that are there with NANAS. We want to do some joint work together around a webinar, and our first go at this now will be a joint seminar, a webinar on publishing in humanities, arts and cultural gerontology. The details will be mounted soon on the GSA website, and I think it brings together these streams, and it's an adventure we're really looking forward to. Lastly, I'd just like to thank everybody at this talk for my own support in the work in cultural gerontology. Wonderful colleagues in TUH, very supportive, a huge arts and health program. Our colleagues in TCD and UCD, particularly for this project. But we've had funding for, and to give people encouragement in aging and humanities work to date. We've had funding from the Irish Research Council, from Wellcome, Sounds Foundation Ireland, HRB, the Mead Foundation, and the Arts Council. But I particularly like to thank my parents. Aging is personal, and my parents gave me a very enriched background, a very broad sense of that aging was valuable and wonderful, And lastly, I think, like most of us, my very tolerant and forbearing family for all the time. As George Orwell says, writing is a selfish occupation. All writers are selfish. So listen, it's been a great opportunity. I'm really looking forward to our work collating and bringing this together. And thanks to everybody.
Thank you so much, Desmond, for that paper. Very fitting to close this webinar as we're heading off into the future and thinking about what's going to come next. I'd just like to invite Julia now to respond to that, if I may.
Thank you, Des. That was fascinating, provocative, positive, generous, all the things we want, especially at this point in the series. So thank you very much. I wanted just to reflect very briefly on these two approaches of medical humanities and cultural gerontology, because I think as this event's shown us and other events have shown us, we share a great deal of territory. There's a vast amount of things that we're interested. We're interested in the same things, similar things, and I think there's been a lot of fruitful cooperation. But I think it's worth reflecting on the way that we come to this territory from different directions. It seems to me that medical humanities, and we can discuss this, really comes from a desire to enrich the medical curriculum, to humanize medical education, broaden the understandings of younger doctors, increase their empathy when dealing with older patients. Now, I'm not saying that's the only reason, but it seems to me that when you look at the websites of where it's located, that there is that strong impulse behind it. Whereas cultural gerontology, I think, comes to this territory from a different direction. It comes really from a desire to enrich and expand the terms within which old age or later years, as it's typically called in this tradition, are analysed and understood. And it's about replacing the limiting and othering discourses of social and public policy with their emphasis on frailty and burden and cost, all the things we know, and looking instead at a much wider set of experiences and understandings, and particularly strongly in that, I think, putting in subjectivity and trying to undermine the othering that is typical of that other form of discourse. So it contains shifts of that sort. And in that, I would say that I think the word gerontology is itself a problem. So there's always a dilemma about quite how to call this area, but I think gerontology is negative. But I also heard, incidentally, what you said about health, Desmond, and cultural gerontology is a failure to talk about that. So we can come back and perhaps discuss and pick up on that. So I think cultural gerontology needs to be understood as both an intellectual and a political enterprise. It has both elements in it. And it's done this by a complex of research, theorizing, writing, drawing on new perspectives, encompassing new material. And broadly speaking, I think we can call this the cultural turn, the wider cultural turn that occurred across both the social sciences, or some of the social sciences, because certain ones like economics or bits of psychology are fairly resistant to this, and have moved across into a more generous understanding with the humanities. And I think the humanities have similarly reached across and been interested in a wider set of discourses than they perhaps did in the 1950s, for example. So I'm talking about a big intellectual change. There's no time here really to expand on what that's done to cultural gerontology, but I can do that if we want to. I think it's been a very fruitful development, but we also need to recognise it also contains within it a lot of contradictions and differences. There's a great range of ideas and approaches. At times, these approaches are divergent and oppositional. We tend not to emphasise these aspects of disagreement and opposition, but they are there, and I think sometimes it is important to look at them. So I think medical humanities and cultural gerontology encompass much of the same territory and subjectivity, but they do so in the different directions, and that means there can be tensions. And I thought, for example, we saw earlier in the sessions that we had an example of this over the role of epistemology and methodology in particular. Something of that emerged in our discussion of French impression, this synoptical theory. I don't know if other people were present at that particular discussion, and we didn't really have time to pull that out and find out whether or not that matters. I think it may be, and again, this is a contentious view, it may be easier for medical humanities to encompass those kind of tensions because it sits, I think, to some degree aside from the core the core of medicine, the core scientific disciplines of medicine. It's there as an insightful bringing of new ideas in, but in a sense it is a separate, and therefore perhaps these questions of epistemology and methodology don't have to be faced down in quite the same way. It's maybe easier to have this broad sitting together approach. So I think it may be harder within cultural gerontology. Again, we could take that further and discuss it more. So really what I want to do at this point is to congratulate the committee for organising such a fascinating series of seminars that have brought such a brilliant range of topics and speakers together. So thank you very much. And I want to underline that spirit of intellectual generosity that seems to me that's marked the thinking behind these events very much, and the Irenic spirit in which they've all been conducted. But just as a question at the end, I also want to raise the possibility of the slight note of contention, in that I think there are tensions and difficulties that lie in an attempt to reach across what's actually a very wide territory. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thank you so much for that, Julia. Yes,
can I just say a very brief word, very brief. First thing is, you've touched on the Achilles heel of medical humanities. If I had longer time, I was going to put it in. I actually think the worst thing that's ever happened to it is the emphasis on undergraduate education before thinking actually what's the body of knowledge and research and scholarship we're developing. So I have to say I have fulminate against the past, and you'll be delighted to hear in terms of epistemic balance, I very often use your definition of cultural gerontology as what the definition of medical humanities should be. And the pleasure or the privilege you have in cultural gerontology is you don't feel you have to teach something to undergrads. You are actually doing expanding knowledge. So, and indeed, the very vagueness you talk about in your definition is wonderfully helpful. So can I say to you, this goes both ways, and cultural gerontology has been very helpful to my understanding and furthering of medical humanities.
Thanks, Anna.
Thank you. I mean, thanks to both of you, actually, and thanks to Julia for actually bringing to the fore some of the unresolved issues, and maybe we can kind of, use this as a point of departure for discussing our September conference. And Julia, the other Julia, couldn't be with us today, but we had a meeting with her yesterday to discuss the next steps. So I'm going to pass on some of the questions that she asked us to formulate and to put it to all the participants of the group. So the first question is, and this is for everybody, what surprised you about this series, if anything? And the second question is, and it's connected, of course, what did you feel distanced from in terms of epistemological or methodological approaches? And what struck you as a foreign way of thinking? So maybe we can actually take these questions, because they're rather big ones. They take you back to actually the origins of this series, which is about the difficulties and opportunities of collaborating across vastly different subject areas. And coming from my own background as a literary critic and a cultural critic, I would, for example, say that medics tend to use literature and art to illustrate certain points. Mm-hmm. And that is not the function of art, and that has very little to do with critical engagement. Yeah. So I'm volunteering this as a perspective of how I think my field can be misunderstood as an ornamental dimension to culture. But I'm sure there are other, many different perspectives. And I think that Julia has actually raised very interesting questions that perhaps we should consider.
Thanks, Julia, and thanks, Anne. And Des and I have had these hardcore discussions really about medical humanities or geriatricians using literature, functionalizing it in a way that we as literary critics don't like. But at the same time, this is exactly where we begin our conversation, I think, and we've been fighting and struggling exactly about this point all the time. And this is something that I think is perhaps a starting point, and it's a bumpy ride, but it's there are very, very few geriatricians and medical doctors in medical humanities who actually are willing to stretch out their hands and try and have a discussion. And maybe we have to fight again this and longer, maybe 3 more years, I don't know. But we might eventually get at the point where we can really reach across and talk about literature and culture and film, not as ornaments, not as something that the GSA puts on a Saturday morning at 8 o'clock when nobody else wants to read and listen to papers, but where we can really work together. So even though we fight all the time, I really appreciate your efforts there. But I think it would be really cool to at some point get together and read a text, close reading a text together, a short story or a poem from the perspective of medical sciences, from the perspective of psychoanalytic criticism, and so on. So I really want to do this, and I've been teaching medical humanities at my university, at the Medical University of Graz. It's exactly what you say. Undergraduates don't get it yet, and we still need to keep going at that. And also these differentiations between cultural gerontology, medical humanities, all these different definitions, we're just working them out now. And of course, there are definitions in place, but they are not very stable yet, I think, some of them. And aging studies is just developing as a fledgling field in a way, and we are struggling for that. But I guess my point is literature is not just something to be functionalized, but and single author papers are very normal, and we don't want to be colonized, by medical subjects and sciences, because the humanities have their own ways of working. And we feel that we are colonized by the sciences. Thanks. Sorry for my rant, but I really love working with you, Dave, of course.
Look, I think the thing is, when we're looking at how undervalued our Schwerpunkt is, whatever it is, what you'll find is, as you go around the table, a lot of other people feel that their really valuable input into something is not valued. I think the presence of formal recognition and activities in the journal is a starting point. But I think your idea of joint working. So, for example, when I was teaching ethics, it was myself and a bioethicist, a theologian. So, who bought, and I think the idea of going through something in that way with a literary scholar is the way forward. But it involves, investment. It involves commitment, but it definitely has to be the way forward. I agree with you entirely, and I think it's important that elements don't get functionalized. But I think the worry of colonizing can go too far as well. I think we had significant difficulty with the reviewer of a paper of having a course for artists in healthcare so that they could get familiarized with what's quite a difficult environment. And the reviewer said, oh, well, that's like embedding journalists in the army in Iraq. And, it gave no sense of that artists are people with formidable independence and insights. And of course, they would kick back against any restrictions. But no, you're absolutely right. I think that there needs to be a respect for the scholarship and the research methods and mannerisms, and working out how to fund and generate interest in those areas must be the way forward.
Thank you, Desmond. I think Susan had a question. Is that right?
Yeah. I just want to engage with that idea of literature and literary critics, because I'm a sociologist that quite likes to dip into literature. Dare I say it, to illustrate my points. But the reason, and I don't know what Ulla would think of this, but I do it because I think that the structures of society and the structures of consciousness are completely interconnected, and that subjectivity is always social subjectivity. And also, I think that you can go back to the origins of sociology, and you can see that there were lots of debates 100 years ago or so as to whether sociology should use literature as one of its primary empirical methods and resources. And it's not popular at all in sociology. It doesn't, many people think it's not kosher, really, that we seem to privilege interviews and mainly interviews, I suppose, but also some field work, although we're not like anthropologists, of course. But I think that, first of all, for me, you can see emerging structures of consciousness, changes in perceptions of aging, for example, or changes in perceptions of femininity at different points of the life course. You know, we can really look back over the last few decades and see that in writers' depictions of aging material through their writing, because they're often at the very forefront of kind of registering these changes in structures of consciousness. But they also give a much deeper insight into sort of paradoxes and contradictions and complexities of subjectivity that are directly relevant to social issues than I've ever been able to get to through just asking people questions. I think it's, so I don't know whether, I hope Ulla would not think that I'm, that's a sort of, you know, using literature to illustrate points, theories. I suppose it is in some ways, but it's very different from literary criticism and, you know, but I think I would like to say that I wish sociology would make it more mainstream. Other people would take, I mean, some people do, obviously, but I just wish that it would be less fringe. I often get comments to papers I send in to journals saying, well, this isn't, you know, why did you choose these texts? You know, did you do a very careful, you know, I mean, just as if it was a sample that I would be collecting, you know, through other means, when literature just doesn't often work like that. It is often illustrative. So I don't know. I found a lot of tensions within my discipline and frictions and resistance to me using these methods. Yeah, I guess that's all I wanted to say really about that. It's not really interdisciplinary, but it is using literature as a window onto subjectivity, which is first and foremost social, in my view. That's it.
You could say there's a kind of parallel, Sue, with the way that historians use literature. I mean, they in a sense, are plural in their methods and plural in their sources. They're really wanting to find whatever they can. And because it's in the past, they can't create that material in the way that we in the present can. But it does mean that they, I think, often use very fruitfully literary sources. And in a way that goes beyond just simply saying, oh, I've got a nice quotation here. It sort of sounds a bit like the sort of thing we're talking about.
Yeah.
Yeah, if I might come back, I mean, the thing about, I think sometimes we're a little over critical that Martha Nussbaum chose to use Greek theatre as the medium for her fragility of goodness. I don't think the theatre and drama faculty went up in arms and said, what is she doing straying on our territory? And equally, I think there is this important element around, you know, as well, I would quote her again about the issue is we can only live one life, and fiction introduces us to a range of other lives. So I think the key thing, going back to Susan's mention of it here, is the question of how we offer our analysis and use of such reflections. And I think if we're offering them not necessarily as, you know, we're not pretending to be a literary scholar, but we're saying what we found valuable and interesting. And my interest, and one of the things I hope to develop in my own section in European geriatric medicine, is when I get in, I'm working on with the editor on it, when I get in a piece around film, is that I would have a short discussant from film studies. If I got in a piece about a novel, I would get a short piece, a discussant. Yeah.
Well, I think the point is it's fine to use literature and functionalize it even. That's all great, you know, and it illustrates things in a very particular way, but it's not doing humanities. And that's exactly the point. Nussbaum doesn't claim she's doing humanities.
Well, no, firstly, can I say that she studied Greek literature? Nussbaum actually knows the Greek culture more than anyone. and she's fluent in Greek, in ancient Greek. So, but that's not the point. The point that I would like to make is I'm not trying to ring fence cultural knowledge and say that we own it. Of course not, that would be a stupid thing to do. What I'm saying is, however, is that it is not about using literature to illustrate a point that where my problem arises. It is about the complete ignorance of the methodologies used by across a variety of humanities disciplines, as if, you know, you didn't need to have these filters when you engage with a particular problematic. So of course we share a set of problems, and we sometimes share overlapping conceptual notions, even though there are interesting differences that need to be teased out here too. My point is really about the fact that what is often kind of occluded from this is the fact that, you know, each discipline requires epistemes, and they need to be handled carefully. So often medics, when I hear medics talking, and this is a bit polemical, but I'm deliberately polemical here now because it's an interesting conversation. Often medics can use literature in a kind of, you know, you mentioned dilettantism, and I would say it can end up like that. Yeah. And of course, on the other hand, humanities researchers need to engage much more actively with the other side of the equation if, you know, if we want to kind of enmesh our approaches to really recreate interdisciplinarity in a radical way that goes beyond having a kind of a little bit of a dialogue now and then.
Mary wants to come in on the discussion there.
Yeah, I just wanted to sort of come back to Susan, but it feeds into what Anna was just saying there, and also just the general discussion. So from the other side of it's not even a divide. You know, the literary text, what do I do as a literary critic like Anna, and as somebody who teaches literature, what do I do with it? I use a heck of a lot of political science in my classes, and and I don't see a problem with that. Now, that's maybe because I'm a German studies scholar, and there's a fine tradition in Germanistic of really great sociologists or social scientists, political scientists who use literature left, right, and center to talk about complicated things in the most brilliant way. So you know, I find it can be very enriching. That might be quite different maybe to, you know, I can't comment. I know I'm not a sociologist, so I can't really comment. I know what I use in my particular seminars. But I just wanted to say that there's a similar sort of, and I don't agree with it. And I know, Anna, that this is not what you are saying at all, right? You've outlined very clearly what you're talking about in terms of epistemes that need to be handled carefully. But there's a kind of a sniffiness around using literature to illustrate certain points about the real, or, you know, reality. That's not what we're supposed to do as literary scholars. That's dumbing down. That's another. I find the sort of that's within literary studies. That's within literary studies. So those divisions exist even within your own discipline. And I just think a slightly more, you know, slightly less judgmental and more kind of curious and probing perspective would be helpful, you know, because I think those perspectives back thinkers into corners that feel tight. Yeah, so I just wanted to come back that it's not that different over here. Yeah.
Thanks very much, Mary. I'm very mindful of the time and that we still have a kind of in-house discussion to have. So I want to just close the public part now of this session, and to thank very, very much again all of the contributors and all of the discussants as well. It was again another fascinating session. So thank you very much to everybody for that.